saw that what toxicologists have to do in medical examiners' offices is to sort this out. What was the drug involved? What happened? You know, based on tox results, you might call something a suicide or a homicide or an accident. You think about how easily one could mix those things up. People often kill themselves with prescription drugs they don't intend to. They don't know about competition for transport. They don't know about synergy between drugs. If you get your drugs at a big pharmaceutical place like CVS, Walgreens, whatever, they have huge databases. And if you get all your drugs in the same place, you're never going to run into a problem where you're taking two drugs that you should not be taking at the same time, because the database will kick out a new script. The problem is these big companies do not share these databases, and for obvious reasons. If I'm CVS, I'm not going to share my customer database with you over there at Walgreens, because you're going to look and say, well, this person's taking such and such a drug. We're going to contact them through email and tell them we'll sell them that drug for 40% less. So these companies don't cooperate, and this produces a real problem. There ought to be a law or something. Anyway, the toxicologist winds up being the person who has to sort all this kind of stuff out. Unfortunately, the toxicologist is stuck with the therapeutic index. In other words, the toxicologist is stuck with the rules, the algorithms that would apply to a living person with living physiology. And that ain't what you got. You've got this entropy challenged lump of cells laying here on the landscape. Think in the problem example that you're reading, 200,000 potential calories out there for critters. And there's some toxic materials on board, but they're not behaving according to the ordinary rules of therapy because the person is dead. That is where toxicologists have to earn their bucks. They have to know the patterns of abuse, because that establishes the kinds of panels and screens that people typically do in a large office. Sometimes we have to go beyond that, do special tests for special kinds of toxins. Always looking for interference, looking for drug interactions, those kinds of things. Tissue sampling is a big deal. In the autopsy that we went through visually one day, you saw a lot of tubes and people sticking things in people and sampling. Tissues and fluids are sampled. The principal organs in your body for detoxification are the brain, the kidneys, and the liver. In those particular tissues, in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of the cells of those tissues, detoxification takes place. So brain, kidney, liver, good tissues to sample. Blood, of course, good tissue to sample. Unfortunately, interpretation of post-mortem levels is not good, because death stops the physiology, and all the rules we have for interpretation are based on living dynamic systems. As I mentioned before, we're usually testing for the principal metabolite of the drug. Also, the body's out there buried or laying around someplace in a clump of clover. Soil can interfere. Decomposing tissue itself and all of those volatiles and fermentation products can interfere. Embalming definitely interferes. If you're called upon to re-autopsy someone, resample the tox, get ready for problems, because embalming is really going to screw things up, and that goes for DNA sampling as well. Also, there are a lot of interferogens. For example, plants produce proteins, broad class of proteins called lectins. Those lectins can actually mimic a lot of things. For example, some plant lectins are what are called alpha lectins, actually show up as marijuana. So you're sampling some tissue that's been laying out there in some foliage. You may think you've got cannabinoids on board, but you don't. You're looking at plant life. So there are a lot of interferogens out there, depending on how the body has been disposed of. Therapeutic index, as I mentioned, is what we're looking for. The lethal dose of a drug for 50% of the population is called the LD50. In other words, the amount of that drug that you would find causing 50% of the population problems, divided by the effective dose for 50%. In other words, what is the dose that would be effective in the first 50% of the people? Those two variables comprise the therapeutic index. So the LD50 divided by the ED50 is the therapeutic index. Those two graphs, the y-axis differs. On the left-hand graph, lethality, and on the right-hand graph, positive response to the drug gives you the ED50. That sigma-shaped curve is basically what the metabolism of any drug looks like when normalized. So therapeutic index is what we're looking for. A couple other important terms, the NOAEL and the LOAEL. The lowest observed adverse effect level. What is the least amount of a drug you can give that will cause an adverse effect? What is the greatest amount of a substance you can give without producing any observable effect? Now think about that a second. Aren't those the same thing? I'm giving drug until I see some subject with an adverse effect. The highest amount of a drug I can give before I see a lethal effect. Well, what's the lowest amount of a drug I can give that produces an adverse effect? Those ought to be the same, shouldn't they? They're not. They're not. And when they are, you're the toxicologist. When those two coincide and they are the same, you know you are pretty close to the true therapeutic index. When they coincide, we are better able to predict what a safe dosage of the drug is. And by safe, I'm talking about the line where you go from a therapeutic effect to a toxic or an adverse effect. That's the line we're looking for in a living person. Unfortunately, that is also the number we have to use in the case of a dead person. And the longer that person has been dead, the more useless, that is, the more difficult to interpret that number is. Now, the same thing is true for adults versus children. You always hear people talk about the pediatric dose should be this, pediatric dose should be that. Ordinarily, a drug is administered on the basis of body mass. Children have less body mass. Therefore, a smaller amount of the drug should produce either LOAEL or NOAEL because they're little. But again, after death, whether it's an adult or a child, the problem is compounded. Okay? So the tissue you select, how long a person's been dead, all those environmental variables, temperature, moisture, clothed, unclothed, semi-hermetic environment, open environment, insects, predators, scavengers, all that stuff, agonistic state, what did they die of, what was their body temperature, all that stuff goes into the interpretation. As I mentioned, embalming. In the state of Texas, you are required to have arterial embalming. That just means that they put a line in your cephalic vein on one side with a withdrawal and put a line in your other artery, in your antecubital artery, and pump in embalming fluid until your entire circulatory system is filled with embalming fluid. In other words, you displace blood. That's required. Cavity embalming. In other words, they stick a trocar into your various body cavities and inject the fluid, is called cavity embalming. That is not required in Texas. In some states, both kinds are. In Texas, arterial embalming only. Now, let's say your grandma dies and she always wanted to be buried in her rose garden out in the backyard. It's perfectly legal for you to do that, as long as you can show the city that you're not interfering with any gas lines, electric lines, anything like that that work crews might have to get to. You can get a permit to bury somebody without embalming, assuming the medical examiner checks off on it, okay? Once you die and all these membrane pumps stop, all the proton pumps, sodium potassium pump, calcium channels, all that stuff stops. Back diffusion occurs. All of those gradients run to zero. That also goes for everything that's out in the circulation. How many of you have had any physiology? Animal phys, A&P, anything like that? Okay, so you know what I mean by back diffusion. Gradient's gone, everything back diffuses. So you take your sample, whether it's a tissue or a body fluid or whatever, you're gonna extract it at several different pHs. But fundamentally, you're gonna be extracting it either at neutral pH 7, or you're gonna extract it under acid pH conditions or basic pH conditions. That will establish whether you are dealing with a class of drugs that are essentially acidic or basic. Barbiturates are a prominent one in the acidic group. Aspirin, of course, is a salicylic acid. Amphetamine, sulfate, phencyclidine, which is a big sleep med. All these things are over in the basic category. Rare earth alkaloids, heroin, cocaine, all those things are over in the basic group because they are basically alkaline earth derivatives. Psilocybin, mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, all that stuff, the whoopee drugs, all that stuff is basic. Having established these different aliquots, you're going to screen it. Screening is a presumptive test. It's just going to tell us qualitatively what we're looking at. And that can be done by thin layer chromatography. Nowadays, we don't make that many TLC kits. Most of it's done by enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, like the ELISA test. One of your COVID tests, for example, was an ELISA test. Ordinarily, these antibodies are tagged with a fluorescent marker. It's just like the pregnancy kit. You know, you urinate on the thing and it turns blue if it's positive when the antigen and the antibody complex. So one kind of presumptive test that's easily available in kits is the ELISA. You can do TLC, you can do gas chromatography, you can do high performance liquid chromatography. Chromatography is kind of a fast and dirty screening. This confirms what you have. Your next problem is quantitation, because we gotta get to that therapeutic index. So we gotta know how much. Gas chromatography gets us the category, and then mass spec actually gets us the molecular fragments, and the software is written so that a particular pattern of molecular fragments is identified as a drug class, okay? So GC mass spec, as I mentioned the other day, tandem GC mass spec is the standard for performance in the industry, has been for many years. And so these devices are constructed in tandem, and the software drives the interpretation. It's very important to think about the route of administration of a drug. So some teenage kid riding a bus, you know, with a brown paper bag, puffing glue out of the bag, you know, chale con el spray. Somebody with hairspray, pumping it into a bag, sniffing it, God knows what. So is it inhaled? Is it something you absorb? Many toxic materials are highly absorbable. They dissolve in lipids, so they go right through your skin. I had to go down in wells a few times to look for bodies where people have been throwing stuff in these wells for 100 years. And one of the things you always have to worry about is hydrogen sulfide, rotten egg. It'll go right through your skin. Hydrogen sulfide is extremely toxic. And so usually what you do is you grab a gob of newspaper, light it, throw it down the well, you know, and if there's any hydrogen sulfide down there, it combusts. Then you jump in your harness and go in the well, and that's a bunch of fun. Surface area is important because something's absorbable. The amount of area over which you're absorbing it is key. Think about firefighters going into a toxic environment. Everything in the house is burning up. Cyanide compounds, ammoniated compounds, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, all these combustion products, and about half of them can be absorbed through the skin. What does that imply for a 20-year career doing this? Not a good result. The order is intravenous, in which case the drug goes directly into your circulation. Lung is the second fastest route. You breathe something, it goes lung to heart to system, just like that. You breathe it, it goes out of the pulmonary system into the left atrium, into the left ventricle. It's throughout your system. It's quick, almost as quick as intravenous. Gastrointestinal, you absorb a ton of medication through the gut. You absorb a ton of medication through the lower gut. You can put drugs in suppositories, put them where the sun doesn't shine, and that person will absorb that drug in about 30 seconds. So the GI tract is another very important route for drugs to get into the system. In fact, most deaths from prescription drugs occur because of absorption across the GI tract. And then finally, intramuscular injections. That's very slow. You put something into a muscular space, the only circulation that's getting to it are very, very small vessels or capillaries, and so that route is slow. So this is fast and slow. IV, lung, GI, and IM. We assume what is called a two-pool open model. If you've read your article, then you know that there are certain barriers to toxins. Your GI tract is an amazing piece of equipment. If you think about it, you're a chordate, right? Your body is really a tube within a tube. Put your finger on your forehead. Where is your finger? It's on the outer surface of your body, right? Now put it on your cheek next to your lip. What surface is it on? Outside of your body. Where is it now? Inside or outside? Outside. I didn't go through anything, right? Think about a donut. You got your finger on the outside of it. Same surface. You are a tube within a tube. Your GI tract is an incredible piece of machinery because it not only has to absorb nutrients, but it's got to defend you against crap that's not supposed to be absorbed. It's the outside of your body, just like your skin. except the surface area of the lining of your gut is about 50 times greater than the surface area of your body. Why? It's all folded into plica, those are folded into papilla, the papilla have microvilli, you know, huge, huge surface area. Lungs, 300 million little air sacs, that's a bunch of surface area. It's about 75 square feet. 75 square feet of absorption in there. In other words, I don't know, 4, 10, about 2 of these sets of boards that each milliliter of blood is exposed to when that blood passes through the lung. That would be the equivalent of taking 10 cc's of blood and painting 2 of these blackboard units with 75 cc's of blood. Pretty high surface area contact. So, hence, the lung is a very effective route. Skin, same deal, if the material is absorbable. What about the placenta? Well, human placentas, primate placentas in general, hemocorial placentae, are an extremely good source of things. And so we always worry about whether a toxin is going to cross the placenta. Can you say crack babies? Right? I got some in my next class, I think. They're all over in the B school, you know. So be careful with your investments. Then the blood-brain barrier. The endothelial line of the circulation in your brain is designed in such a way that it only allows certain molecules into the neurons and the glial cells of the brain. And I think we want it that way. You won't want just any old thing that gets into your system to get into your brain, you know? And so your brain, like your gut, is incredibly selective. There are only a couple of places where the blood-brain barrier does not exist. One is in the vomit center, because you want toxic materials to be recognized there. So they gotta be let into the tissue so that the brain can set in motion a series of reverse peristaltic events, and you can throw it back up, get rid of it, have diarrhea, whatever. But for the most part, with the exceptions noted, another exception would be the part of your hypothalamus that connects to the pituitary gland, because your brain has to store certain things like oxytocin and secrete them into the pituitary. So that one's leaky as well. For the most part, your brain is sealed off. And then, of course, the cell membranes themselves are selective, right? Your cells don't just let anything in. Let me tell you, of the roughly $15–20 billion a year that the pharmaceutical industry spends on research, a huge chunk of that is in trying to find ways to get a particular drug into your cells. Because after all, that's where all disease is, ultimately. It's in your cells. So if you've taken a drug, you want to get it into your cells. But the cell membrane is very selective. So you have all these barriers, the various toxins. We put a drug into your system by one of those routes. The drug goes into the system, it's in your blood, and that drug is in free form, just the raw molecule, and it's also bound. Now, if you take an antibiotic, for example, everybody in here probably taken tetracycline, erythromycin at some time or other. You take an antibiotic, you basically urinate away 80% of it. To get a therapeutic dose in your tissues, taking an initial dose and then so many tablets per day, whatever, to establish an effective dosage, you only bind about 20% of the drug. You urinate away the rest of it. So this drug is now in the system, both free and bound, in the depot, and some of it is gonna go back and forth into the tissues, and then it's gonna come out in the bile, which is stored in your gallbladder. It's gonna be found in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is not necessarily in the brain, it's around the brain. Some of it's gonna be excreted as urine in unmetabolized form, and some of it will be secreted as metabolites. This is where drugs go under normal conditions in a living person. When toxins are eliminated, a big part of that elimination is linear. In other words, it's directly time dependent, upper left to lower right. However, it's affected by what are called clearance thresholds or renal thresholds. You're in a helicopter. You're flying over American Center during a basketball game in downtown Dallas. The game is over, the crowd floods out into the plaza. There's a dart station right there, and 3 cars worth of dart pull up. Some people leave the crowd and they get in the car and it goes away. 3 more cars pull up, people bail into those cars and they go away. Another 3, and then more people go away. Here's this huge pool of people waiting to be cleared. What's limiting the rate of clearance? Yeah, the rate at which those cars show up. And there is a definite, a defined limit on the availability of transport molecule. So when you reach transport threshold, okay, when you reach transport threshold, that's as fast as you're gonna clear it. Now, there are a lot of things that can affect it. The most important one is hydration. Hydration. Why? Because most of this stuff is cleared through the kidney. What do you have to make the kidney work? Hydration. Gotta have water. It's gotta be adequate water in the blood. If you take a dehydrated person and you give them drug X, so much of drug X, you take a normal, healthy, well-hydrated person and give them the same amount. The person who's hydrated will eliminate the drug. The person who isn't, it'll stay in their tissues. So, all of the dosages that people are given, you know, take this pill this many times a day, on the clock, don't screw up, assumes that that person's got enough sense to drink water. I've been there, baby. I have made that mistake. You know, I remember on a number of occasions thinking, man, I have got hold of some really good stuff because I'm just stupid as a brick, and it's been 2 days since I took it. You know, well, I'm not drinking any water. I'm not a great fan of water. Water isn't interesting to me. But I can tell you that if you have a dehydrated person, that's going to be another way people get into trouble. Okay, this was long, long ago and far away in another galaxy. Okay, so you can just eliminate that part of the recording. Usually, we're excreting this stuff through the kidney, but it has to be prepared, and that's where the liver comes in. The gut absorbs a lot of stuff, and it excretes a lot of stuff through the bile. It goes away as solid waste. But the bile also conjugates a lot of this stuff. In other words, the raw drug or the metabolite is conjugated to something that has charge. Positive or negative charge, doesn't matter. When a material goes through the liver, which is where everything in your gut goes, by the way, everything in the drainage from the gut, in the vascular supply to the gut, goes directly into the hepatic portal circulation. It goes right to your liver. That's the whole point, right? You eat a bunch of protein, your break it down into amino acids, they go in the liver, and the liver reconstructs those amines into new amino acids, and you're in business. But in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of those hepatocytes, as in the brain, as in the kidney, charge is added. And when you charge something, what is its relationship to water? What's a water molecule look like? Come on. Polar. Yeah, it's polar. So if I put charge on something in the liver, it's gonna be water soluble. Yeah. That's why you have to be well hydrated to get rid of stuff. Because basically what the liver does is it processes the drug however it's supposed to, but then the detoxification step involves adding polar conjugates. And that makes it ready for the kidney to deal with. Okay? So, a lot of times when an organ is involved in eliminating a particular toxin or metabolite, it makes that particular organ a target itself. Classic example of this is somebody who has liver cancer, okay? They're hurting, they're really in pain all the time. Or someone with chronic kidney pain. Well, what do you want to give them right away? Yeah, pain med, an analgesic. Where are drugs cleared? Liver and kidney. So the very set of tissues that's responsible for clearing the drug is now under assault from a new drug. It's a spiraling kind of thing, right? Becomes an incidental target. Heavy metals are a good example. If you're exposed to lead, bismuth, aluminum, all kinds of metals, they tend to accumulate in the fat space of the body. There are numerous case reports in the literature of people who have a lot of extra adipose on board, exposed to toxic metals, maybe occupationally, maybe like those poor kids living near the RSR lead smelters in Dallas for years and years, who lost God knows how many IQ points from living near the lead smelter. Nobody ever went to jail over that. They shut them down, but the bastards who knew, who were responsible, are off scot-free somewhere enjoying their ill-gotten gains. And a lot of kids are enjoying, you know, life on the whole because they're dull-witted. There have been a lot of clinical studies in which people have been put on water and vitamin diets in hospitals to shed a lot of extra weight, who have actually poisoned themselves with heavy metals stored in their fat tissue. So heavy metals are an extra problem, an extra burden for the liver and the kidney. So it'll take years or decades in some cases for the effects of toxins to show up. Another important occupational group, as I mentioned a minute ago, are firefighters, first responders who go into a place where you've got who knows what kind of crap being absorbed through your skin, inhaled. I was teaching a class very much like this on September 10th, and then on the next day, bombing happened in New York around 9 o'clock, and I was in a different class and went home and got my go bag and was on the ground at Vesey Street in St. John's at Ground Zero late that evening, setting up the temporary ward, breathing up God knows how many Manhattaners and all the crap that went into the air for about 3.5 months. As a result, I was compelled for about 12 years to go in every year for CT scans, pulmonary function tests, toxicology tests, all kinds of stuff. And as you know, many people actually suffered bad pulmonary results. Most of them were firefighters because they had a long history of exposure starting out. People with bad habits, like smoking, don't do well in the long run because they're already under assault, and then they expose their respiratory systems to something like that. It's not gonna work out. But damage can occur over a long period of time, and this is a life-shortening sort of thing. Less toxic byproducts are eliminated as metabolites. Things that get methylated, I'm sure by now all of you are familiar with the wonders of methylation, especially in your DNA. You want to keep those methyl groups around, keep those ugly RAS genes turned off by methylating the DNA, the modification chains on the histones and so forth, lock them up with some methyl groups. The lung, the gut, the kidney, send everything to the liver, where the smooth ER adds conjugates. In the first pass, you get oxidation, demethylation, and the addition of sulfoxide groups, which are negatively charged, right? So hydroxyls, nitrogen in its various forms, oxygen in its various forms, get added to these compounds, which makes them water soluble. That's in the first pass. In the second pass, you get more conjugation with glucuronic acid, which is produced in liver cells, and also sulfate ions. Bottom line is, all of this is now ready to go. It's water soluble, and the glomerular system in the kidney, by both active and passive transport, is going to eliminate this stuff in the urine. So this brings us to another really important concept, which is renal clearance. How much urine do you make in X units of time? How much urine do you make in a minute? This graph actually shows you the initial drug up here, which is really high when it's administered. And you can see that it declines in predictable fashion. And you would expect that as the initial drug is getting processed, some of it is being converted to metabolites. So that's increasing while this is decreasing. See where these two curves cross right here? About that point, the metabolite begins to be cleared really rapidly in the urine. You start to see it show up in the bladder. This is one of the reasons why you stick a big old needle in the bladder during an autopsy, like we saw in the autopsy discussion. And then this is the parent drug, which rises slowly as drug is cleared and as parent drug in the tissues builds up. We see that very shortly into the process, we reach a peak of the drug in the tissue, and then it declines as well. This little graph is basically a summary of everything that happens from ingestion or injection to elimination of the drug. I believe this appears in your reading as well. So you should take a good close look at that. He said, now we could think about your excretion of a drug. It'd be useful to think about sampling as well. You can find drug in just about any body fluid: saliva, tears, blood, in the bile coming out of the liver, mother's milk. My God, there have been famous cases where mothers have been prosecuted and put in prison for giving their children cocaine. because ergotamine, the principal metabolite of cocaine, showed up in the kid's blood at autopsy. Well, the mom was taking a cold medication or a sinus medication or something. And she was bioprocessing it into its basic components, and the kid is showing up with the kid's breast dead. But the famous instances, like there's one in Canada, a big famous case in the literature where the kid was breastfeeding, and every time the mom had custody, the kid would get sick again. Well, mom was breastfeeding the kid. It turned out that she went to prison for murdering her kid. Fortunately, the sister was also a hypermetabolizer, and the same thing began to happen with her kid. And a very clever pathologist in Canada, one of my favorite all-time pathology heroes, spotted this genetic syndrome running in the family, this hypermetabolizer thing, which means that the kid is going to get an amplified dose of everything the mother's got on board. I've had cases personally where a kid failed to thrive, and you got to looking at the tox, and the kid showed nicotine. How many infants do you know of who are chain smokers or chew? Not that many, surprisingly. But the mom, is not paying attention. She's breastfeeding this kid, smoking 3 packs a day. Of course, the kid's going to have nicotine. Just a normal one. So we're looking to see how fast the kidney can get rid of these materials. Doesn't it stand to reason that if a person has kidney issues, they're not going to clear a drug as fast? Just like if they're not hydrated, they're not going to clear as fast. Somebody's got problems with their renal clearance for reasons of kidney disease or whatever, or because something else is competing for those 3 dark cars in the parking lot, competition for transport molecules. But that person is also going to have difficulty getting rid of a drug. The concentration of a drug in the urine, milligrams percent in the urine, divided by the concentration of the drug, milligrams percent, in the plasma, in the blood plasma, is going to be multiplied by how fast you form urine, how many milliliters per urine minute of urine per minute do you make. All of that is renal clearance. So urinary concentration divided by blood concentration times number of milliliters per minute is your renal clearance. Every time I had one of those CT scans, they gave me a contrast median. And you better believe that every single time they did, they measured renal clearance, because they want to make sure that I'm going to get rid of that contrast medium, which is a nasty metal. Your mouth tastes funny. Have you ever had a CT scan? You know what I'm talking about? Taste that stuff. Yeah, but the taste is.
It tastes like metal.
It is metal. Which is why they measure your renal clearance, make sure you get rid of all the damn metal. Anyway, renal clearance is another important factor. Otherwise, the toxins will accumulate in organs, lead in your bones. We can see traces of lead during development in kids who are exposed to lead, either through paint, old lead paint, on it, on fences, chewing on it, breathing it. You can actually see lead outlines in bones. Asbestos in your lungs, another example of something that's stored in your tissues. Bioaccumulation can produce toxic effects that are chronic or subclinical until accumulation reaches a certain point, then you die way too early. Carbon monoxide and fire. Carbon monoxide and suicide. Typically in a fire where people perish, we measure the carbon monoxide levels in the tissue, and we find that children have much higher carbon monoxide levels than adults, simply because physiologically infants respire more often than adults. An infant respires about 20 times a minute, you respire about 12 times a minute. And so you would expect to see higher carbon monoxide levels in an infant exposed to the very same fume, very same fire. Trailer house burns up, everybody burns up. People don't die from fire, they die from inhaling toxic materials in the fuel load. The furniture, the piping, all that stuff turns to toxic gases. You absorb them, you breathe them. So we always measure carbon monoxide levels. Now, let's say somebody's a bad smoker. They're gonna die faster from carbon monoxide inhalation than somebody with clean lungs, because they're already carrying maybe 5 or 6% extra carbon monoxide around. Now, what's the problem with carbon monoxide? The problem is that it has about 400 times the binding capacity for hemoglobin that ordinary oxygen does, or that CO2 does. Carbaminohemoglobin, carboxyhemoglobin, nothing like carbon monoxide. Bad stuff. Alcohol is another common issue. For anyone's money in the business, alcohol is by far more dangerous than any of the other drugs you can name. Not so much because it's more toxic, but because it's so much more prevalent. Everybody and his brother and his dog get hold of alcohol. You know, with fake ID, you're in business. See me after class, I'll tell you how to make a really great fake ID that'll pass airport inspection. Free, completely free. We give this to you as a love gift to be sure that you can always supply yourself with ethanol. I like for people to be safe. I don't want you drinking anything out of a bottle off the shelf, you know, that you know it's the real thing. So just to keep you out of harm's way, I'll tell you how to get a fake if you don't know. People get pulled over, right? What's the first thing to remember when you get pulled over? The most important thing. What? Shut up and be nice, okay? Don't be a wise ass. That will get you in trouble. If you happen to be carrying a weapon because you've got a permit, the very first thing you say to that officer is, I'm obliged to tell you that I have a permit to carry and I am armed. If the officer says, would you please remove the sidearm, what's your appropriate response?
Tell them what you're doing, what you're doing.
Do what?
Like instruct what you're doing, what you're doing. Grab it, or mysterious.
Just tell them, I prefer if you remove officer. Why? Because they get out of the car 2 at a time. There's one standing at your window. There's one over here on the other side of the car. That window's rolled up. That person can't hear the conversation. What's that person gonna do when you do this? They're gonna shoot you through that window. Because they think you're going for your weapon. They're not part of the conversation. You tell that officer, I'm really nervous about this person over here. He's not part of this conversation. I'd appreciate it if you'd remove it. I'll step out with my hands up. But I'm really concerned about that other person. Now, if he says, hey, back off, the guy's gonna hand me a gun, fine. And then use your offhand, pick it up with 2 fingers, hand him a weapon. Don't try to discharge it and take the clip, just hand him a weapon. There are a lot of deaths every year, by the way, from that second person who thinks something bad's about to go down when you start to unsnap the weapon. So, they'll roll the window down, they can smell alcohol in your breath. It accumulates in the airspace around you. The amount of alcohol that you exhale is directly proportional to the blood concentration of alcohol. That's why breathalyzer devices work. What's drunk in Texas? 0.08. Right? Who else has 0.08? And drives funny? Diabetics. If you're a diabetic, you're weaving all over the road because you're in a state of ketoacidosis. Number one, you're driving like a drunk. Number two, when you roll that window down, what are they gonna get a nose full of? Acetone, right? You smell like a drunk. And you're behaving like a drunk. Maybe you're really slipping off into ketoacidosis. You need help. More than one person has died because somebody miscalled them. They used to have a 5th semester med student down at Lou Sterrett Justice Center in Dallas, believe it or not, supervising all of this stuff. And somebody would get really weird on a bus at 3 a.m. and the bus driver would call it in, and the cop would take some stumbling, mumbling fool off the bus, throw him in the slammer at Lou Sterrett, where they would die from inattention as they slipped off into a diabetic coma. So if you're a brittle diabetic, you know, wear one of those bracelets or something, for heaven's sake, you know, let them know it's not booze, you know. And above all, you know, if they say, would you please step out of the car, don't say something smart like, nah, you get in, let me just move these bottles out a little bit. Don't do that. Humor is not helpful in those situations. The officer's gonna check you by talking to you and looking at you. And then they ask you to step out of the car. Motor control is very important. If you don't have any, you're in trouble. Now, if you have a physical injury that makes it impossible for you to take a field sobriety test, make sure they're aware of it. Do so politely. If you just broke your foot, I got stopped, and I had the boot of shame on. You know, when I got out of the car, the guy could see there was no way to pass the field sobriety test. And I was very polite, and he finally said, well, don't drive that thing on. You know, I'm not gonna say, look, my doc said it's fine for me to drive it. I'm not gonna argue, I'm just gonna say, okay, I'm gonna go right home. Put my foot up, thank you very much for your courtesy. They're also gonna check you for other drugs. They're gonna look for needle marks. They're gonna check your eyes, your appearance. Are you disheveled? I'm always in trouble because I'm always with disheveled. What do you do for a living, sir? Well, I'm the director of a large laboratory and I'm a scientist. Yeah, right. You and Alfred E. Newman. Your behavior. Are you being smarmy? Are you being reasonable? They're going to do an eye exam. They're going to look for lateral gaze and nystagmus. Your eyeball has a number of muscles attached to it called extrinsic muscles of eye movement. One of those muscles is called the lateral rectus muscle. And the lateral rectus is under control of the oculomotor nerve. And if you're drunk and somebody says, follow my finger, when your eye is in maximum turn, in other words, when that lateral rectus muscle is really tight, it'll bounce, it'll spasm and twitch, and your eye will twitch. That's called nystagmus. So lateral gaze nystagmus, very important giveaway. Now, if you know you're a little buzzed, you can beat that. Wanna know how? The officer doesn't know how far you can rotate your eyes, does he? Or she? So just rotate your eyes a little bit. Don't put them in full lock so they start to bounce. Just follow the finger a little bit. And then follow it the other way. Don't let that happen. And for a free bonus, I'll tell you how to cheat a lie detector test too. We should have a whole forensic class on how to beat all this stuff. And people that get a certain grade get an extra free Zoom tutorial on how to beat all this stuff. Vital signs, you're gonna check your blood pressure, your pulse, all this kind of stuff. Now, in Texas, if you refuse a field sobriety test, you're going downtown. If you refuse to take a breathalyzer test, you're going downtown. Now, there are a number of sources of things in your mouth that can create a bad result on a breathalyzer. There are a lot of mouthwash products that have alcohol, gargles, things like that. Regurgitation, if you throw up, you can produce mouth alcohol from the regurgitants passing through your mouth, have alcohol in your stomach. There are a whole bunch of things that can give a false reading on a breathalyzer test. So, your best bet, if you think that's what's going on, is get up and draw blood, because the blood test takes precedence over any results on a breathalyzer. Encourage it. Just take me down, take a blood test. Right now, do it right now. Don't delay. Muscles rigid could mean amphetamine, could mean other drugs. Anybody who is buzzed on alcohol might be taking other things. They're gonna look for injection sites. They may make you roll your sleeves up. All the good injection sites, as real junkies know, are places like under the tongue, in the labia. If you've got some ink on you, red ink is really good, like you've got a big old snake with a red eye. That's a real good injection site. Hard to find those needle marks, even for a pathologist. And then coordination. You know, if there are reasons why you have difficulty locomoting or walking or bending down, picking something up, putting your fingertips together, make that clear, okay? Here's the blood alcohol curve, and you can see that right there at 0.8, you're about 4 times more likely than normal to have a wreck. Right? Alcohol has different effects on different people. If you have a fast metabolism, and you're a great big person, the same number of drinks is not going to cause you to flunk these tests. Your blood alcohol can be much higher than 0.08. It could be 0.1, 0.15, 0.2, and you may not be showing any signs of inebriation. Officers are taught to take this kind of thing into account. For that reason, if you refuse all the tests, it used to be the case that you would wind up in court some weeks later, all cleanly shaven, you know, with your nice suit, you look better than the judge, you know, and it's your word against the officers. They got a fix for that now. They take you down and stand you on a little X in a tiny room facing the camera. And then they ask you to do various things. They ask you to go over to a wall, open a drawer, take out a card with 3 different sizes of print on it, read all of those in some sequence, put it back, get back on the X, on and on. You have to do a number of motor things, visual things, and it's all on film. And if you screw up, they'll bring that film into court and say, yeah, well, he says he wasn't drunk, but look at this, Your Honor. And here's this drunk peeing in a trash can over in the corner on film because he's an idiot. You know, they're actually a tape. See. So there's no way around it. You need to be cooperative. But people do vary with respect to, I had a grad student once who now works in the DNA lab at FBI, who used to go over every time the sheriff's office would conduct these alcohol consumption tests to demonstrate to their officers how much people vary. This guy is about 6'5", weighed about 250. I used to get student evaluations. We want to see Jeff in the nude, you know, all the time. He would take advantage of the fact that it was basically free alcohol day, and he'd go over to the sheriff's office and just drink them all under the table. And then go home and, you know, do his homework, read a book, have dinner, play with his kid. His metabolism was incredible, and it's huge. And so he'd put away a bunch of vodka or whatever they were serving and walk out of there, everybody scratching their head, you know. There are people like that. There are also little tiny people who have the metabolism of a hummingbird. I saw one of these videotapes. A little tiny woman must have weighed 100 pounds on a chubby day, who had been going down Greenville Avenue at Warp 6, and she'd had a couple of margaritas for lunch, and then she and her girlfriend drove out to the lake with some kites, you know, and put away a short case, and were blazing along somewhere and got picked up. And I think she was .22, and her conversation was just as normal as mine. It was like, yes, officer, yes, I'm all right, getting a little to drink today. Oh, let's see, I had about 3 sunrises at lunch, and we put away a short case, and then this and this, and on blah, blah, blah. She's perfectly coherent. She would have passed a field sobriety test. So people vary a great deal. Point A is the real issue. You know that we take alcohol from vitreous humor. Now, this is not like that potassium thing. Vitreous is a jelly-like, very slow physiological fluid. It takes a long time for vitreous to turn over metabolic. And so if we draw vitreous and we take blood from a dead person, if the vitreous is higher than the blood, we know that person is still metabolizing. They're not as drunk as they're gonna get. On the other hand, if the blood is higher than the vitreous, then we know they're coming down. Now, this is used in the so-called last drink law. If you're a bartender and you serve somebody who's already obviously inebriated and goes out and gets killed, kills somebody and gets killed, they're gonna find out, because they're gonna measure both of these, and they're gonna be able to estimate when this person had their last drink. That, on top of other evidence, is gonna put you on that bar stool. The bartender's gonna get in real big trouble. I actually witnessed this one time, in a bar, where a cab driver was having a little nightcap and was really blasted, you know, and announced to everybody he's gotta go get back in his hack and pick up a few more fares before he went home. And the bartender had enough sense to restrain him and not let him go out and then finally call the cop. But we do measure vitreous as well as blood for that reason. Heavy metals, as I said, usually that's a chronic problem, but occasionally someone will get a fatal dose of a heavy metal. We have all kinds of tests for heavy metal. Now, you've had a bunch of chemistry. If you wanted to detect a metal in solution, what would you do? What kind of reaction would you be looking at? You'd want to create a salt of that metal. So you probably had a reagent that was at slightly low pH, and you create the salt of that metal, right? In other words, you precipitate. It's a presumptive test, but the Reich test is an example of a commonly used heavy metal test that'll detect bismuth and antimony and mercury and all kinds of things that people typically accumulate over time. Cyanide is a different issue. We don't do much cyanide poisoning anymore. We used to poison people with cyanide. Most of the time, it's a suicide. Hospital workers, technicians, others who have access to the cyanide compounds in the medicine cabinet are usually the ones who self-administer cyanide. It's a very effective suicide drug. It produces a pinking up or reddening of the skin that can easily be mistaken for carbon monoxide poisoning, where you also go pink. But usually, the effects of cyanide are seen in fires. As I said, first responders are usually the ones who are exposed to these combustion effluents. We set houses on fire from time to time with cadavers in them to demonstrate what happens with bodies in fires. But the fact is that everything in this room is fuel. It's part of the fuel load. Most of the things in this room, when burned, most of the polymers in this room, when burned, will produce cyanide. Polyvinyl chloride, pipe, furniture, fabric, nylon, rayon, a lot of clothing fabrics, all produce cyanide when they're combusted. And exposure is cumulative in these kinds of occupations. 50 or 60% of the deaths that occur in structural fire, buildings, offices, houses, are actually due to cyanide. Since there are more and more synthetic materials around, this is a bigger and bigger problem. I don't know if you remember the big fire in Philadelphia in a rock club that had that kind of nibbly foam acoustic wall material in it. That stuff generates cyanide by the ton. And the whole building was lined with it. And around 160 people perished from cyanide poisoning. This is in 89, 90. You guys probably weren't alive. But it was a terrible disaster that really alerted the community to the dangers of combustion products. People who have chronic occupational exposure these days, career firefighters and so forth, are taught to recognize and log in the number of hours and minutes that they are exposed in any given instance, so that we have some measure over the years of what their chronic exposure looks like. That's just part of the job. Insulation products, carpets, anything that's synthetic, it's a devil's soup, literally, of various toxins. So we need to describe the units in which this stuff is measured and concentration over time. A couple definitions. The LC50 or lethal concentration of 50 is like LD50. It's the amount that will result in death in 50% of the people. We usually measure exposure in grams per cubic meter. And just for your reference, meter is 1.3 cubic yards if you're a non-metric person, and 28.4 grams is an ounce. We also measure this in parts per million, and then the incapacitation number for 50% is the IC50. That's the amount of exposure that will simply incapacitate. Now, what does that mean? That means slurred speech, blurred vision, crazy talk, stumbling, all kinds of inhalation exposure. When you're in that kind of scene, you absorb it through your skin. You may ingest it. You're definitely going to inhale. And chronic inhalation is the greatest threat over a career of exposure. So we have a list of various things. People discount carbon dioxide, but let me tell you something. When carbon dioxide plus a closed space equals 15%, you're in trouble. It's not as bad as carbon monoxide. But carbon dioxide will kill you. If you're incapacitated, you can't do anything. So you might as well be dead unless help gets there. Nitric oxide, of course, various other kinds of hydrogen and ammonia compounds. And I mentioned to you dangerous combinations of cleaning solutions. Formaldehyde, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen cyanide, all these things can be produced by burning stuff that's in this room and on your bodies in the way of clothing. You don't have to memorize this. Polyurethane foams and things like that always produce an incredible amount. And we can think about these things in terms of ventilated and non-ventilated spaces. When you're working with something that says use in well-ventilated space, use it in a well-ventilated space, or you're gonna get cumulative effects. Exposure times, some of the symptoms that you can get, central nervous system, nausea, little things like that, followed by coma and death. You would know you were having symptoms because you would know what occupation you're in, you know what to look for. Okay? Acute exposure, the real concern is heart failure and respiratory collapse. They can kill people pretty quickly. Respiratory depression or arrest. Here's a guy that's pinking up. You can see what this looks like. Most of the therapy that you give people like this is B12, cobalamin, massive injections of B12, plus oxygen, of course. But these are people who have been exposed to cyanide. The guy on the top right and the bottom look just like people who have been carbon monoxide. So if you begin to notice yourself looking a little pink, get outside and breathe fresh air. Things to monitor. If you've got bad habits, get rid of them. You'll survive longer at fire. Okay? All this is posted